Welcome to Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Relationships are important to all of us, men and women. Broken promises, missed deadlines, poor behavior, these are issues that arise from relationships that don't just make others' lives miserable, they sap up to 50% of organizational performance and account for 90% of divorces. It's ideas that matter to women of worth, and my guest in WOW this evening is Joseph Grenny, one of the co-authors of the book Crucial Conversations. We speak about his new book, Crucial Accountability, and how the path to accountability can provide tools we can all use to improve relationships at the workplace and life between and for men and women.
Joseph, what did your research show about why the majority of people seem to be silent on the issue of accountability?
I think the primary reason is a lack of skill. We're trained from the time we're young to assess threats, and our reflex response, sort of the natural response of human beings when we're going into uncertain situations, is to withdraw and to seek our own safety. And unfortunately, we're not overtly trained out of that. So when we see problems and concerns, when we're frustrated with other people's behavior, when they let us down or offend us, our natural tendency is to recoil and withdraw and to protect our safety. What we found, though, is that if people can understand their skills to do this in a way that doesn't put you at risk, but that actually solves problems, that they're far more likely to adopt that healthier approach.
Why did you and your co-authors want to write this book? You mentioned it is a subset of the conversations in your first book, Crucial Conversations, but why so specifically focus on this area?
Well, it's really one of the behaviors that drew our attention to begin with. Crucial Conversations lays a very important foundation of how to bring up emotionally and politically risky issues. But the primary thing that drew our attention in studying organizations is our discovery that the most important behavior that leaders can foster is peer accountability, creating an environment not where bosses hold direct reports accountable, but where peers hold peers accountable, because that's where the action is. That's where most activity and teamwork and action happens every day in organizations. And if peers aren't handling problems as they surface, then the problems fester. So, for example, in our research in healthcare, we found if individuals see peers or colleagues breaking rules or putting patients at risk, there's very small chance that they'll say anything. And so these problems persist and become habits and norms, and it undermines organizational effectiveness profoundly.
Now, it seems to me that your approach to accountability is not a practical guide to being subtly sanctimonious. In fact, it calls for great awareness on the part of the conversation starter. For example, you say, before you open your mouth, ask what and if. Can we start with the what? When is it prudent or not prudent to hold accountability discussions?
Yeah, the what question gets more to, what's the conversation I'm going to have. So if, for example, my boss is behaving in a way that is of concern to me, oftentimes when we open our mouth to speak, we speak about the wrong thing. We don't hold the right conversation. There are different kinds of conversations. We talk about content conversations, meaning the problem that just occurred. Pattern conversations, meaning this is sort of becoming a norm or a pattern. And relationship conversations, meaning it's not even about what just happened. It's that we have a major trust problem or respect problem in our relationship. So the very first decision somebody needs to make before they ever open their mouth is, what are they even going to talk about? And if you don't do that consciously and thoughtfully, then we tend to talk about either the easiest thing or the most recent thing, which often isn't the most important thing.
What is the difference between the question, the what, and the if question?
So the if question is if I should speak up. So should I even open my mouth? Should I even hold this conversation with somebody? And that's an important judgment to make. The challenge in that one is that often what we do unconsciously without even realizing it is we do a threat assessment. We ask ourselves, what is the risk of speaking up? So we think of all the bad things that might happen. My boss might hate me or might undermine me, or my peers might be resentful and hold it against me, or my spouse or a loved one might be hurt. So we think of all the negative things that could occur. And when you do a threat assessment by only looking at the negatives, it's fairly predictable what you're going to do. You'll take the safe route out. What we encourage people to do as you're thinking about whether or not you're going to speak up, the if question, is to also look at the risk of not speaking up. It's very important consciously to say, all right, I understand these are potential risks of speaking up, but what is going to happen? What will most certainly happen if I don't speak up? And if you do that, if you consciously look at both sides, then you're in a better position to make a rational choice rather than an emotional choice, which almost always moves you to silence.
Do you think the ideas in your book work better in some cultural contexts than others, in that in some cultures and organizational cultures even, respect for authority is seen as inviolable?
Yes, I definitely do. So first of all, this isn't a binary question. So when I travel around the world, many times they say, well, in some countries, so for example, in Holland and the Netherlands, there's this reputation people have of being very candid and open. And in Thailand, for example, when I travel there, there's a reputation of people having real reverence for hierarchy and not speaking up in those risky situations. And the truth is that there's problems in both areas. When we do research in the Netherlands, we find that people aren't candid nearly as often as they think they are. And when we do research in Thailand, we find there are people who find a way to respectfully speak up and bring important issues to the surface, even with those who are above them in an organization. So both behaviors happen in both places, but obviously with different frequencies. The cultural impact is an important differentiator. What we primarily focus on in our research is not whether something is culturally appropriate one place or another. What we're trying to determine is what are the costs of behavior. And that way leaders, independent of the culture they're operating in, can decide, do I want that? So if you have a culture where the norm is for people not to raise issues, not to raise concerns, not to speak up when there are problems, then what is that costing you today, and do you care enough so that you would pay attention to that? What we know is when leaders pay attention to it, you can foster a culture of candor and openness. And if you're in a culture where it's seen as disrespectful to ever disagree with the boss, that comes at an enormously high price. Our research asks the question, are you willing to pay that?
Do you think your book is of use to the individual within a large corporate culture who wants to influence upwards?
Yeah, most of our research focused on that exact question. We were working in large companies early on and doing our studies of what affects organizational performance. And what we found is that there are individuals who, irrespective of their position, find a way to be honest and open, but in a very respectful way with those above them in the organization. So that's what we primarily focused on. We talk a lot in the book about peer accountability and bosses holding individuals to direct reports accountable. But the toughest condition under which to test these principles and skills is, can you do this with those who have more power than you? And if it doesn't work there, then it's of limited use. And our research suggests that you can, that those are the conditions under which these principles work.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
You say it's very important to set up a climate of safety, and I've heard you mention the word respectful. You are able to hold these conversations in a very respectful manner, and I believe that setting up conditions for safety allows for better conversations, just in my limited experience. But tell us about the first few seconds of the interaction and what people can do to set up that climate of safety.
Very good question, Michelle. We focused a lot on what we call the hazardous half minute. So the first 30 seconds of a crucial accountability moment. And it turns out that how somebody behaves in those 30 seconds matters more than any other part of the conversation. And there are two things you have to do in that first 30 seconds. We talk in the book about many ways of accomplishing these, but these are the objectives. The first is you need to create a condition called mutual purpose. You need to help the other person know, in other words, that you care about their purposes, their goals, that you have mutual interests. When people believe that, when they believe that your intentions are good and that you're not just here to create trouble or to criticize them, when they really understand and trust your intentions, they relax and they start to listen. There's a physiological, biological reason for this. Our brains are programmed to look for threats. And so your job is to give that person's brain information that says, I am not a threat. I may look like I'm a threat, but I'm not. I care about your interests and goals, and in fact, if we can have this conversation, you'll be able to accomplish even more of what you want. So that's mutual purpose. The second is mutual respect. They need to know not just that you care about their interests or goals, but also that you care about and respect them. So if you can create those two conditions, then people tend to relax and listen non-defensively. Now you get back to your cultural question, and in some cultures you'd communicate respect by not making eye contact or by giving somebody physical distance. Sometimes there are certain words or scripts you can use that communicate that you care and that you respect the other person. Once they're assured of that, even if they have more power than you, then they open themselves up and they allow you to disagree with them.
You also give very specific tools for the content of the conversation. Can you walk us through the CPR acronym?
Yes. So this is the question of what should we talk about. So CPR stands for Content, Pattern, Relationship. These are the three different kinds of accountability conversations you need to have. So let's say, for example, that you have a colleague that's supposed to get you information every Wednesday, and they're often a day or two late. Now, the question becomes, as you talk with that person, what should you discuss? Should you talk about that last week they got the information 2 days late? If so, you're having a content conversation. That's about one specific instance of concern. Most likely you need to have a pattern conversation because, as I mentioned, this is happening chronically. That would sound different. It would not be, let me talk about what happened next Wednesday. It would be, out of the last 2 months, 7 out of 14 times it's come a couple of days late. That's a different conversation that leads to a different solution. And if you have the wrong conversation, you can end up solving a problem that doesn't get you what you want. The final is the relationship conversation. Let's say you concluded that this person is not trustworthy because you've spoken with them about the pattern before, and they continue to be late. They continue to give you promises and assurances, but they don't keep them. Well, then it's not time to have a pattern conversation. It's time to have a trust conversation, a relationship conversation. And so it's very important, and this acronym helps you to keep this straight. It's very important to think in advance, what's my real concern, and how can I raise that in an effective way?
And also to be aware of the story you're telling yourself about why a person's acting a certain way. For example, you say it's important to understand the 6 sources of influence. Can you walk us through those?
Oh, very, very good, important point. When people behave badly or when they let us down, they break promises or violate expectations, it often provokes our own emotion. We often have feelings and upsets about that, and those are our responsibility to work through. What we found is that if you can recognize the story you're telling yourself that is agitating those emotions, that's creating them, that you can get back in control, and that will help you have a healthier conversation with somebody.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Welcome to Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Relationships are important to all of us, men and women. It's ideas that matter to women of worth, and my guest in WOW this evening is Joseph Grenny. We speak about his new book, Crucial Accountability.
What we found is that if you can recognize the story you're telling yourself that is agitating those emotions, that's creating them, that you can get back in control, and that will help you have a healthier conversation with somebody. So let me give you an example. We were working in a healthcare setting, and a nurse was concerned because a doctor had walked up to her and was about to address her and then looked down as though he was trying to see her name tag, and then in frustration after a second or two said, "Oh, forget it, I'm not going to learn your name until you've worked here for 2 years anyway," and then he yelled an order at her and then turned around and walked away. So she was very concerned. She didn't feel that she was being treated respectfully. Now, he's a very powerful person in this hospital. She has relatively less power. But this was also a very skillful person. Now, there are 2 problems that she needs to work on before she can have a healthy conversation with that doctor. The first is her own emotion. So notice that he said to her, "I'm not going to learn your name until you've been here for 2 years," and raised his voice. The challenge is not just what he did, but the emotion she has about what he did. She feels offended. She feels angry. She feels upset. Why? Because she's telling herself a story that he's doing this intentionally to demean her, and that it therefore means that she's less worthy and less respectable. if she can get control of that emotion, be aware of that, and not become hostage to that story, then she can feel liberated and approach him and actually become curious, actually become interested about why he handled that the way he did, and have a healthy conversation. One of the ways you do that is by exploring these 6 sources of influence. These help you understand that people don't always just do things because they're being intentionally evil or malicious. There are a variety of reasons they might do them. What she discovered is she went and approached him and she tried to say, let me describe what just happened, and I'm concerned about that. Doctor, were you angry at me? Did I disappoint or upset you in some way? It turned out that the real reason was not that he had bad motives, but he had an ability problem, and he was embarrassed about it. He had bad eyesight, and as he was looking for her name tag and couldn't see it, he grew ashamed and embarrassed, and he took that out on her. So after becoming curious and going and approaching him, she discovered, as she looked at the 6 sources of influence, it wasn't source 1, a bad personal motive. It was source 2. It was an ability problem. And as you start using that element of the crucial accountability model to really explore why people are doing what they're doing, it helps you with your emotions. It also helps you solve problems in a better way.
Oh, that's a terrific story. And tell us a little bit about what one can do when the tone does become confrontational in a crucial accountability conversation.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to do in those moments. We describe these in the book. If somebody's emotions are escalating and that's getting in the way of the conversation, there are 2 things that you can do. The first is you can try to create safety. What we know is that people either withdraw or become hostile, usually not because they're incapable of having a healthy conversation, but just because in this moment they don't feel safe in this conversation. So what we teach is a skill called step out of the content, step out of the issue you're discussing, and restore safety. Meaning, try to find common ground. Try to reassure them of your intentions. Try to clarify any disrespect they might be feeling from you. So if, for example, you're disagreeing with your boss and your boss starts to become hostile, you might set aside the issue for a moment and say, boy, it seems like that this is coming across as disrespectful, or that I'm just trying to criticize. Please understand that I'm not. Just a small little statement like that can often help the other person collect themselves and to recognize, oh yeah, you're not a threat to me, and then the emotion calms down. So safety skills are one big issue. The second thing to do if things become hostile is change the topic. So if the content issue, the subject we were discussing, is being distracted by emotion, perhaps it's important to set that aside for a moment and to say, boy, it doesn't seem like the conversation is working very well. How can I do this better? And so stepping aside and talking about the conversation itself, changing to that topic until we find a way to move forward in a healthier way. Maybe it's taking a time out. Maybe there's something in the way I'm presenting my points that is unnecessarily offensive. But stepping aside and discussing that can often help to restore a sense of safety as well.
It sounds though like in any conversation, it requires both individuals to be present in the moment. What do you do with an individual who does not want to change?
Yeah, actually, I'd frame that differently. So obviously, if both people are conscious and present and skillful, then there's a much higher likelihood of success. But that wasn't what interested us in our research. We wondered how does it work when only one individual is conscious and skillful, and what skills help in those conditions. Right. So the skills we describe in crucial accountability really only require one to dance, not two to dance. And yet, if we learn to dance with each other, it does go better.
Productivity is a real buzzword here in Singapore. And I read productivity in terms of, needing teams to be restructured, to be doing things differently. I've read, not in this book, but in an article about it, that the book says productivity should be benchmarked with milestones. Yeah,
we wrote a book called Influencer that looks at how you create profound, sustainable behavior change in organizations or in any human system. And one of the keys to influence, the very first, is being very clear and deliberate about what you're trying to achieve and how you'll measure it. So if productivity is important, then the only way you'll influence it in an organization is to track and measure. It has to be out front. It has to be refreshed regularly. Anything that you're trying to influence change around has to be measured and refreshed, and I would include productivity in that respect.
Can crucial accountability help us cope with holding social media conversations? I've also read a survey that your firm did showing increased hostility on social media platforms. Can the book help with social media conversations?
Yeah, we address social media conversations from two perspectives. One with crucial accountability. One of the challenges is when people misbehave in social media and people try to hold them accountable, it almost always escalates immediately. And the challenge with that is the human brain, as we discussed earlier, is designed to assess threats. And a significant amount of cognitive real estate is committed to assessing threats by examining faces. From the time a baby is very small, it recognizes faces and it learns to read facial expressions. And so we're really good at that. The problem on social media is that since we don't see the face of the person writing it, we imagine it. And we imagine their intent, we imagine their purpose, we imagine their respect level, and it's never good.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Okay, and very often the corrective feedback in the real world seems to rely, when people feel that they are out of their safety zone, they rely on force. But you say force kills relationship in the book. Can you share with our audience a little bit about the use of force and why a judicious approach is useful?
Yes. The challenge we sometimes have in accountability conversations that we describe in Crucial Accountability is that if we don't have enough power to force the other person to comply at the end, we often wish we did. And so when others don't seem to be motivated to make changes, the question becomes, how do you motivate the unmotivated? Our tendency is to want to use coercion. We want to use force. We want to use formal power. And that's why we believe, falsely, that if you're not the person's boss, that you can't have an accountability conversation.
And that's why an authoritarian structure is so common in many organizations.
Exactly. Yes. And ironically, even the bosses tend not to have the accountability conversations when they should. But let's leave that aside for a moment. We tend not to speak up when we should because we think, well, I don't have the power to force them to participate or to engage in this conversation. What we found is, even with bosses, the most effective at holding accountability conversations don't rely on imposed consequences or coercion. They don't use threats. They don't threaten somebody's job. They don't try to use unnatural or imposed consequences. That would be the equivalent of a parent who says, you know, you hit your brother, so go to your room. I'm giving an unnatural consequence. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't impose those at times, but I'm saying that they shouldn't be what you start with. Those who are most effective at accountability conversations tend to start with natural consequences. What they do is they make the invisible visible. They just help people understand the consequences of their choices that they may not be aware of right now, how it's affecting other people, how it's affecting the organization. They try to lay out those natural consequences in a way that often motivates action. So I'll give one example. One of my children once got in trouble with the police because he threw a water balloon at a car with his friends in the dark. So this lady was driving by and they threw a water balloon and it crashed onto a windshield and she slammed on her brakes and pulled the car over and then called the police on her mobile phone and the police came and found my son and his friends and called the parents. So I'm now sitting down having an accountability conversation with my son. And the question for you as a parent is, where do you start? Do you start with threats? Do you start by imposing unnatural consequences? Do you start by saying, you know, you're not going to be playing with friends for the next 9 years or something like that? And again, I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be consequences like that sometimes, but it's important to think, where do you begin? Well, you begin with natural consequences. So I asked him, I said, hey, son, when the water balloon hit the car, I want you to imagine for just a moment you were the woman driving the car. And can you guess for me how it felt? And we talked about it for a moment, and he sat there for a long time thinking. He hadn't even given any thought at all to the consequence to her. But pretty soon his eyes opened really big, and he started to tear up. And he said, I think I know how she felt. And I said, why? And he said, because after the water balloon hit, she slammed on her brakes, and then she put her head down on the steering wheel. And I said, oh, why do you think she did that? He said, because I think she was crying. Now, something happened in that moment. He got connected to a natural consequence. Within just a moment after that, he said, Dad, would you help me find her phone number? I want to call her up and apologize. Now, when he was connected with natural consequences, that's the best corrective strategy that you can give. And now, again, it may be important at times to add other consequences as well. But the greatest source of power we have is just helping people to understand the natural consequences of their behavior, and that helps to change behavior in a healthy and long-term way, in a way that unnatural consequences can't.
How important, in your opinion, is empathy in facilitating crucial conversations?
Oh, it's absolutely critical, because without empathy, we commit what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. When others behave a certain way, we tend to attribute it to bad motives. We think of all the bad reasons that they're doing what they're doing. We tell ourselves what we call villain stories in the book. And that jacks up our emotions. It escalates our own emotions. Empathy helps us break that cycle. When we take ourselves out of our own situation and stop personalizing others' actions and ask ourselves, why would a reasonable, rational, decent person do that? What could be going on for them? What sort of different trade-offs or different perspective might they have? Well, we just use our imagination to empathize a little bit. It helps us much better to get out of what we do that provokes our own emotion and start to create a healthy dialogue.
And really, you showed us with that example with your son about how you were able to harness empathy. But not everyone's as skilled at conversations as you are to be able to do that.
Oh, and I'm not either. That was a good day.
But why do you say that, if the stick doesn't work, then the carrot approach should be used judiciously as well? You say be careful with perks.
Yes, the idea behind perks is to use extrinsic rewards. It's to say, can we artificially induce people to behave in a particular way? Those most of the time come with unintended consequences. So it's important for us to connect people with the natural consequences, natural motives for changing their behavior, and then just use carrots and sticks as a supplement.
Now, to the listener listening in, thinking, okay, I'm going to pick up this book and I'll be able to pick up some great tips. You say patience is required because, like anything, this is a skill, right? Having a crucially accountable conversation takes patience. Yeah,
just as you brought out at the beginning of our conversation, Michelle, the primary reason we don't hold these conversations is a lack of skill, and this requires deliberate practice. I mean, if you're 40 years old and you've gotten the habits that you have now around dealing with accountability concerns over a period of 40 years, you got to give yourself at least a week to get better, maybe longer. And so the good news is this: you don't have to be perfect. You just need to make progress. You don't have to get good at all of it. If you just make a little progress on some of these crucial accountability skills, you see a significant improvement in the kind of results and relationships you're able to achieve.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.